Drafting the FFPC $35 Superflex tournament for a chance at $50,000. That is what we are doing on this edition of RotoViz Overtime as we draft against the RotoViz Overtime community, Shawn. And what is going to be a fun thought experiment, I guess we can say. The rules truly go out the window in these RotoViz OT drafts. We have had some of the most fun we've ever had drafting in those leagues. So looking forward as we draft against 11 other of the RotoViz Overtime community from the 106 slot. We did our preview show, Shawn, as we talked some strategy earlier this week. So looking forward to this. And as we talked on that, we talked about the ADP. So far, it's Jalen Hurts, Patrick Mahomes, but the first jump has been for Justin Jefferson. So that part of the conversation is out, Shawn. But we did talk about the option for Fields and Lamar Jackson. So there's going to be one additional quarterback in our conversation here, one pick away. How are you feeling? Is it Fields? Is it Jackson? I know we're waiting to see who goes, but that other alternative option is, I was going to say Joe Burrow, but Justin Fields has gone off the board. So which way are you feeling as we sit here at this moment in time?
Well, Colin, I mean, this is a chance to get Burrow a little bit later than
usually at the fourth pick, yeah.
Right. And so that's pretty tempting. We discussed in the preview show that this favors hybrid QBs even a little bit more. Lamar Jackson is very compelling, even though supposedly he's going to run a little bit less. Let's throw this one over to you and give you your pick to start us out on our first OT Listener League draft.
Yeah, I think we have to just take that a little bit of a discount on Burrow here. Fields, I think, would have been more tempting if it was Jackson who had went, but I feel like Burrow is the way to go here.
So select Joe Burrow. We know that in other formats, Lamar Jackson is quite a bit more expensive. Colin, would you expect that ADP to flip as we get a little bit deeper into the tournament?
I'm not sure. I think that because Burrow has the multiple stacking options, and I know we have potential cheaper options once we go past Mark Andrews for Jackson, I think the potential to be able to stack the Joe Burrow side. The tricky part is you aren't going to get him with Chase, then it's to see if you can get a fourth round T Higgins potentially on it, and that can be a little bit of a challenge as well at the slot that we're drafting on. So I think we're still going to see Burrow go a little bit heavy just for the reason of the possible options to boost the overall lineup.
And obviously we know that week 17 of the 2021 season, Burrow and Jamar Chase were absolutely on fire, delivered tournament winner to Connor O'Driscoll and many other people across the fantasy landscape. Colin, you mentioned T. Higgins. He is at the 411, and that may seem a little bit surprising until we obviously work through the fact that all of these quarterbacks are going to be drafted before that time. The QB right before Higgins is Derek Carr at QB 19. If we saw Higgins slide to that point in this draft, we would obviously have a shot at him at the 407. But as you mentioned, we kind of think that the wide receivers will be more expensive here than they normally are. Colin, we kind of prepared a couple of different scenarios. We put our plan together based on ADP, but ADP that was shifted a little bit in the direction of receivers. One of the things that we talked about in the preview show is that when you lose that flex and it becomes a super flex, and so most of the time you're hoping a QB goes in there, wide receivers become a little bit less powerful. It's no longer, in effect, a 2-4 lineup. It's more of a 2-3. So 2 running backs, 3 wide receivers. But the other part of it is that if the running backs are really good value, you could be tempted to go with a roster where a lot of the time running backs are going to factor into the flex spot. So we're very early on here. We're still at the beginning of the second round, but are you comfortable if we end up with a wide receiver avalanche draft, taking some of these values at running back, hoping these guys stay healthy? One of the things I should point out here that is pretty interesting is that when you pull up this format, you make the appropriate tweaks to show what you think is the most efficient in the flex. The Win the Flex tool gives us very even values for running backs and wide receivers as we move through the draft at the current ADP. So for at least from that perspective, if the draft skewed wide receiver heavy, at least in theory, and we know from 600 plus episodes of OT now, that there are other considerations in this running back versus wide receiver dynamic. But there's a possibility that running backs could be pretty good values in this draft.
I think they will be pretty good values. I think we'll see the wide receivers go off the board. We even, the fact that we were talking about T. Higgins as a late fourth round pick, I think he's probably going to be gone in this. If we don't take him at that 306, he may already be gone, as kind of my opinion of how the draft may play out. So some of the wide receivers, if we are wanting to get them, you're probably going to have to pitch a little bit ahead of ADP. That's why I do feel like in this second round, wide receiver is very important for us, because I do like a lot of the values then that are going in those other rounds, as we mentioned, for running backs, that is, and kind of 4, 5, 6. There's some interesting names in there in this particular format. So does that make you want to edge more towards the wide receiver position? Because the other player that is highly of interest in this for me would be one Jonathan Taylor, who I think is going criminally undervalued as the draft has progressed. For people listening on the audio side of things, since we picked it as Lamar Jackson, Travis Kelce, Herbert, Lawrence, Chase, McCaffrey, Kupp, Hill, Deshaun Watson, and Amon-Ra St. Brown, that means that so far we haven't seen Austin Eckler go either, who usually goes in this range now where the next couple of picks are. But it is going to be a little bit tough, Shawn, to pass up some of the receiver options, but maybe that's where we do a little bit of a detour. We maybe take Taylor here or Eckler, and then we look in that third round for the likes of Wilson, Jalen Waddle. I was about to say Amon-Ra St. Brown, he usually goes in the third. He's already gone, so that makes it a little bit tricky. What are your preferences here? Is it going to be tough to pass up JT if he's sitting here in one pick time?
Well, I mean, you've got Bijan Robinson, Austin Eckler there ahead of him by ADP. Taylor might even come back to us in the third. And that's where we get back to this difficult
dilemma. Because the thing is the superstar and the likes of a Taylor as we sit in the clock is available, but there's also going to be those extremely appetizing picks in round 4, round 5 at the running back position. So I'm kind of happy to go the quarterback or the wide receiver route here if that's what you want to go, but it really is at wide receiver Diggs, who are not extremely on it. I think that kind of starts to push you back into that Jonathan Taylor or Austin Eckler conversation again.
I think it does too, because as you mentioned, the guys we would have been excited about, Amon-Ra, third round ADP goes early in 2, CeeDee Lamb, early third round ADP goes mid 2. I mean, now you're talking about reaching for Garrett Wilson or Jalen Waddle, guys with late third ADPs. That's fine. And there are a lot of scenarios in which that probably makes the most sense. But let's go RB here, Colm. QB wouldn't be another option. Do you like Austin Eckler?
Let's go JT. We've been saying JT's ADP is ludicrous. We have to act on it here now. Austin Eckler at this point is kind of ludicrous as well, Shawn. But we have to practice what we preach. That is what we tend to do here on. We're not just talking up these players, we're going to draft them as well. 1v1, Shawn, Austin Eckler's ADP in this particular format, a little bit ahead of Taylor. He's usually running back 2. He hasn't gone yet. Bijan Robinson did go 1 pick before us. So Taylor is usually, 6 picks or so after Eckler. 1v1, do you think that you're going Taylor over Eckler? I think I still am going Taylor over Eckler.
I don't know. I mean, Eckler has so many different ways that he can win. You're going to have a much more functional offense, and you're going to have all of those receptions, and they don't get neutralized in this format in the way they might in half PPR. The other thing is that, I think we could have set up for getting both players if we had selected Eckler, because running backs are going to fall so much in this draft. The next couple of running backs I don't think are nearly as interesting. Saquon Barkley has an ADP at the 212. I would expect him to come back around to us.
I think you've been very optimistic to say if we took Austin Eckler that Jonathan Taylor would have lasted a full 12 picks to get back to us. I think that's optimistic.
Well, he's at the 210. This is going to be a wide receiver avalanche draft. That's the part where you can potentially get a draft here. So when you have the avalanche draft, that's going to take a lot of opportunities away from you. It's going to make it much more difficult to get the receiver value you need to be competitive. On the other hand, the potential value here is that we're in the tournament with this league. And the thing that you mentioned there is, Jonathan Taylor in round 3, but there are going to be very few teams that are set up with Eckler, Taylor. I think that was a possibility. We'll have to maybe survey the group, see what everyone would have done. I think that Saquon Barkley is going to be available here, but that's going to give us a little bit of a proxy. If Barkley goes in these next couple picks, we'll know that my theory was wrong.
Yeah, we'll see what happens. Eckler did go at the third last pick off the second round to the Justin Jefferson drafter. So that's a Jefferson Eckler start. And that might seem like it would be unique, but in this particular format, based on Jefferson usually going kind of pick 7, pick 8, and then Eckler usually going at the start of that second round, it probably is unique from the third spot, but overall probably not as unique. Though since we picked Stephon Diggs has gone, 2 has gone, Eckler, AJ Brown, Garrett Wilson, Jalen Waddle. I think, Shawn, this is a situation where, as we mentioned, with the kind of avalanche happening, the wide receivers that usually go in this draft through the full third round have now gone at the 301. So that's Jalen Waddle, usually wide receiver 11 at the end of the third round at the 312. We did talk about T. Higgins, Shawn. This is a draft where I mentioned he could be even gone before it gets back to our selection here. Is he somebody, based on how the draft's playing out, that you'd be willing to take at the 306, which would be, over around ahead of his current ADP? Obviously, we'll see what other options are available when it does get to us, but I think it's going to be. And the other thing you mentioned in our preview show is Kirk Cousins. The Jefferson drafter now is on the clock, has a chance to go Jefferson, Eckler. He goes Breece Hall, could have went with the Kirk Cousins. So that was something that we talked about being a potential option for the Cousins drafter. Passes on him twice there. How do you feel about our selection here at the and I know Hall would have been another name that would have been in the conversation.
Yeah, so Breece Hall actually goes way above ADP, even in this particular style draft that we're doing here. So we are seeing the OT favorites go early, which is the other thing that we expect. We're going to have to be able to get off of some of our players, or at least be comfortable with paying prices that are not great values to the market. Tua goes a little bit early. Garrett Wilson and Jalen Waddle obviously go early. Waddle was really the guy that we wanted as our third round pick. Breece Hall goes a full round early, but now the Donnie Hula bowling team has Justin Jefferson, Austin Eckler, Breece Hall. So that team is set up, I think, to win the tournament. I love that element of it. Devontae Adams goes at the 304. So we have the next pick here. Dak Prescott and Kirk Cousins are around below ADP. That part is kind of interesting. This was the other element I thought we might get in this draft, which is QBs falling. And then how do you react to that part of it? Saquon Barkley didn't go, and he is an option here for us then. I think Chris Olave is the other player who is at least vaguely interesting here when we think about how the ADP for wide receivers are going to be shifted up. Olave and Devontae Smith are potentially guys that accomplish what we want. So the question I think for you would be, do you have Higgins close enough to them that you want to go ahead and complete the stack? There is always the possibility too that these drafters in the back half, which will be the guys we have to pass on here, that they actually go for these QBs now and start to push the wide receivers down.
There is a possibility, but I think that's less likely. I took the first 2 picks, kind of, Shawn, by my push, so I'm going to let you push on this one. Shawn knows the player that I want, but we'll see who he takes. I was hoping, Shawn, you were going to take Kirk Cousins with that pick. He takes T. Higgins. We'll see how much of the audience believes that selection. I know I would have leaned Higgins, and I know we're reaching there. I know we're reaching over, Olave, for example, who by ADP, and Devontae Smith by ADP. I think there's a chance, as you were saying about the running backs, I think there's a chance that some of those quarterbacks could continue to fall into that 4th round selection that we have now. And I do think because of the wide receiver avalanche that if we get to the 5th round, like you can be really wiped out at that point. And I would have been more tempted there to go with Saquon Barkley over the quarterback. What was Higgins the player that you thought fitted this team best, or were you looking to go with one of the quarterbacks or Barkley?
I think Higgins is probably the player who fits best. For me, the other 2 options in a draft that I do expect to be very receiver heavy would have been Devontae Smith and Chris Olave. I don't think that they fit quite as well. The other element there is that, heaven forbid, Jamar Chase is injured. T. Higgins is then in the mix to be the overall wide receiver 2. Again, if something were to happen to Justin Jefferson, then you're saying he's in the mix to be the overall wide receiver 1. And from a tournament winning perspective, I think that is the way to go. We talked about really wanting to get a triple anchor, which we have with Joe Burrow, Jonathan Taylor, and T. Higgins. For me, the rank on the players would have been those 3 receivers, then Barkley, and then the QBs, in part because I think the QBs are going to fall through. But at the same time, the drafters at both 11 and 12 don't have any QBs yet. And we could get back to our pick in round 4 and basically QB ADP, even though Prescott goes a full round below ADP, even though Cousins is not off the board yet. By the time it gets back to us, it's basically going to be the same guys who are gone, who would be gone in any normal draft.
I would agree. And as we were talking through it, I was thinking these drafters who are in spot 11 and 12, it's going to be interesting to see what they do, because spot 11 is Jamar Chase, Tyreek Hill. Spot 12 is Christian McCaffrey, Cooper Kupp. And I think that they're probably licking their lips if they were hoping that they would have quarterback options. But we see, we do have a true OT listener here in spot 11 as they go for the 3rd wide receiver here to kick things off. But I think they have an option there that would have really given them an out to get one of the quarterbacks like a Kirk Cousins in this situation to pair with that start that they had, which would have made that roster pretty unique. But they have a chance here potentially coming back in that 4th round. So we'll see what happens. I just think getting absolutely blocked out at the wide receiver, and you made a good case there for Higgins as the upside play from that. I think when we're looking at a tournament, you're trying to win the entire thing. I do think the advantage of having Burrow and Higgins in there, they play the Chiefs in week 17. We might have an option to add in some Chiefs pieces later on. One thing that when I made that decision on the Burrow Jackson pick in the 1st round, what I was thinking then as the rounds went on, I was thinking, oh, it would be nice actually to potentially have Lamar Jackson to pair him up with Mark Andrews in the 3rd round. Mark Andrews did go 1 pick before our T. Higgins pick there, so that would have been a crushing blow if we were looking to go in that direction. Kirk Cousins does go to the team in 12. They now have added in TJ Hawkinson, which gives them Christian McCaffrey, Cooper Kupp, Kirk Cousins, TJ Hawkinson for an interesting start to actually give him that stack as well for Hawkinson and Cousins. Hawkinson's usually a mid 4th round pick, so the value that he's picked up on Cousins of pretty much a round and a half is, I think that's a really nice start there for that team in 12. We are 3 selections away from ours as Metcalf and Amari Cooper go off the board. Some of the names in the queue, Shawn, here are Ramondre Stevenson, Jamar Gibbs, and Kyle Pitts. This is a zone where we kind of talked about some of the potential running backs that we think are big values in this format. Barkley did go off since our last pick, but the likes of a Ramondre Stevenson here would be very interesting. Is he the prime target if he makes it back to us? Travis Etienne potentially would be in the mix there as well. This next 2 to 3 rounds has some very interesting players that, depending on how ADP falls, could be really good. But for me, I'd be hoping that we can see Stevenson make it through here.
Yeah, this is a little dead zone-ish just overall, in that the names who are values here, the guys who are top of ADP, you have players like Geno Smith, Aaron Rodgers, Josh Jacobs, Derrick Henry. Tony Pollard is exciting, but Nick Chubb, Russell Wilson, Derek Carr, Najee Harris, Jordan Love. Those players all make sense, right? It's not that we're out on those guys, and especially Josh Jacobs after what he did last season. I mean, you could argue he should be even higher, but these are not fun names to pick. You're not going to be excited about pulling the trigger on any of those guys in round 4.
Yeah, so that gives us 1 selection as we with Geno Smith, Jared Goff going off the board. It does feel like a QB kind of semi-running back dead zone here with some of the names that you mentioned, the more veteran side of things. Deebo Samuel goes off the board at the wide receiver position. That puts us on the clock. Shawn, Stevenson is available. Gibbs is also available there. But I think playing the ADP game, I think Stevenson's probably the way to go here to see then if Gibbs or potentially Pitts, for example, makes it back to us here in the 5th round.
I agree with that. And you look at what he did last season, really distancing himself from another talented back in Damian Harris, even before Harris has the injury elements. You think about Stevenson, and to be that size, to have the hybrid ability in an offense that we think is going to take a big jump. You're suddenly talking about one of these legendary upside types of backs. You're talking about a guy who could be the overall RB1. Certainly you're talking about a potential league winner with spike weeks during the tournament time period, when we look about what's going to be available here and we think about how you would address the starting spots in your lineup and how you would overcome if you ended up getting caught out at QB, the way that you would overcome that would be through hitting on a large number of top 6 or 7 running backs. And so we're going to have to kind of balance the potential incentives and values that those types of players would bring with trying to create the overall roster look that we want. Because again, here, the issue that you run into is that you wait at QB and if you miss, I mean, it can really take apart your entire team.
It really can. So we'll see how it happens, Shawn, over the next couple of rounds. And I think it's starting off to be pretty interesting. So through those 4 rounds, just to have a quick kind of stock of what we've done so far. We have Burrow, we have Jonathan Taylor, we have Ramondre Stevenson and T. Higgins. I'm happy with how that has played out so far. When we set this up before, I had kind of the priority targets in that I was hoping to get. Now, in that 3rd round, Jalen Waddle was my priority target. That was not possible based on how the wide receivers went. We took T. Higgins, who was my 4th round priority target at that particular point, but Stevenson was also in the mix there. So we've pretty much kind of got what we wanted through those opening 3 or 4 rounds. Sorry, the ideal scenario for me would maybe have been Higgins in the 4th and then getting that Waddle pick, for example, in the 3rd, but that was just simply not possible. How are you feeling through those opening 4 rounds as it gives us that kind of triple anchor that we talked about with the quarterback, wide receiver, and running back, then adding on that second running back, which in this format, as we talked about with the flex and how it's set up, there is a nice balance as well with the running back position rather than having to have the wide receivers.
Right. And we don't get to do a lot of running back heavy drafts because it very rarely makes sense. Right. So if we get put in a position where that's what the draft is giving you and that's what the format is mildly suggesting, it can be fun to end up with a vaguely running back heavy draft. Now, one of the things that I think really cuts the other way is that I have a lot of running back targets in that sort of round 15 through 20 range that if we ended up wanting to just completely stack up at running back late, I think you can do that. I think it's harder at wide receiver where you really more or less don't have anybody you like there. But one of the cool things about this, again, is I think you can get really weird with your positional allocations in this format as long as you get wide receiver covered. Now, one of the things that just happened here, 2 picks ahead of us in round 5 goes Jerry Jeudy. His ADP in this format is the 612. So again, you're getting a little bit of a feel of where not just wide receivers are going, but the specific OT types of wide receivers. We have Keenan Allen and Jerry Jeudy ranked much earlier than where they go by ADP. Keenan Allen, who is 601 by ADP, he went at the 410. So, I mean, we're not going to get those guys that we really like. We have to keep that in mind through the next couple of rounds. But the other thing it allows us to do is to maybe not get caught out at quarterback, as we've discussed. As we get kind of to this area column, Aaron Rodgers is a 3rd round ADP. Russell Wilson and Derek Carr are 4th round ADPs. They're both still available here for our pick. And yet I think we can actually pass them. I think they will come back to us.
I have one name in mind here, Shawn. I have one name in mind as we're on the clock.
Hit me with it.
Guess it.
Well, I feel like you're ready to take Kyle Pitts.
That is who I'm ready to take. Are you ready to take Kyle Pitts?
Well, I think we could go with ETN here. I would have preferred to go with Jahmyr Gibbs. He does go a couple spots ahead of us. ETN, Walker, taking the quarterback. But
hey, let's go ETN then.
There's not a player here that really pushes in that direction. And I think that, I mean, the OT listeners understand some of the peripherals that Kyle Pitts put together last year. Anybody who is kind of thinking about Kyle Pitts and how he fits for the 2023 season, what the upside is, what the downside is. Colm, Ben Gretchen and I recorded a Stealing Bananas episode last week that dives into some of that. That was one of my favorites episode-wise in the last year. Anybody who hasn't checked that out, make sure to do so. I think you'll at least feel mildly more confident in Pitts after you listen to that. Now, that doesn't mean that he's going to hit, but just we want to think through what are the range of outcomes? How are those outcomes priced? What does it mean from a tournament winning perspective? What does it mean as we think about who we might draft a QB later in this draft? I think there are a variety of ways that Pitts makes sense here. And even though the round, I believe it is, yes, round 12 through 14, we have a bunch of tight end targets. Again, if we get a little bit lopsided in positional allocation there, the tight end premium in this particular format is very favorable for tight ends carrying you. That's one of the things that's happened to us the last couple of years. Mark Andrews carrying us in 2021, TJ Hawkinson carrying us in 2022. If Kyle Pitts can be the guy here, I mean, one of the things that it can be hard to effectively think through when the previous season has been so traumatic is that, you're just getting very different prices than you got last season. So I like that. And the other thing, Colm, that it allows us to do is that we now have an elite, or at least potential elite, someone that we're banking on being elite at all 4 positions.
It does. And I don't know if Shawn heard it or if it came true. I did say, okay, we'll take Travis Etienne here, and then Shawn drafted Kyle Pitts. So I'm happy with how things have played out. Etienne may sneak back to us, Shawn. The thing I was going to, he doesn't actually, he goes at the 5'10". I was going to say that if we pass on Pitts, the target then in the 5th round for me was going to be Dallas Goedert. We did do a little bit of back and forth conversation yesterday in preparation for the draft, and Goddard is interesting. That was a point that Shawn had made. Goddard goes on the very next pick after we did Kyle Pitts. So how do you feel now with the Pitts selection now that Dallas Goedert went in the following pick? A little bit better about it? Feel the same? What are you thinking?
I do. When we didn't know, obviously, who was going to be available in round 5 as we were gaming this out, Dallas Goedert was maybe not the top, but he was definitely one of the top 2 or 3 guys that we were emphasizing in round 6. I think that he's a much safer way to play it than Kyle Pitts. And yet at the same time, if you're in this hybrid offense where the passing numbers are going to be capped, if you have 2 superstar receivers ahead of you, then that's also going to cap your ceiling, at least to an extent. Drake London looked very good at the end of last season. He's someone else who put up elite peripherals from a weighted targets per route, from the ability to draw targets. He was the guy down the stretch with Pitts out. He's not someone who's coming off of an injury like Pitts is. And yet there's a very real scenario in which this team takes a big step forward as a passing offense, and that Pitts is the driver for that. You get a lot more safety with Goddard, but you don't get quite that ceiling scenario.
I would agree with that. And as we move in, something that I talked to you about when we were doing the preparation was the potential of that Atlanta stack with, Pitts, London, and then going with Ritter. And that's kind of a thing that you'd normally have to do 3 rounds in a row with selections. But Drake London does go at the 5'12", somebody who I think is interesting this year. So since we selected, it's Goddard, Walker, Carr, Etienne, Dobbins, then Matthew Stafford. Aaron Rodgers hasn't been drafted, Shawn. Could be interesting. What Russell Wilson could be interesting. But I think we're in a zone here where there's a lot of names, Pickett, Jordan Love. There's some that you can kind of stack a little bit cheaper with their, wide receivers and so on. And there's some wide receivers in this zone that we do like as well. So this is going to be an interesting couple of rounds. And I am really enjoying how this is starting to shape up for us so far. Have you a priority target? Is Rodgers or Wilson, are they somebody that you're interested in, at this particular point off the draft? I think I'm happy to play it out, and see what we can get. Even though the part that gets tricky here is Rodgers now, who's normally going, as you mentioned, in that kind of late 3rd round, is in the zone where we would be starting to think about potentially drafting Kenny Pickett or Jordan Love. And that feels like a bit of a stretch in terms of trying to make the case for Love at this particular point, or for Pickett, who I would like to get. The other option is we could just try and let things continue to slide and see how far quarterback does drop in this, and then see what our options are. So far through the draft, we have every team barring 2 at this point has at least 1 quarterback. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We have 7 teams with at least 2. One of those has 3. And then we have ourselves, the team in the 101, with 1 quarterback selected. The team in 3 and 11, they have 0 quarterbacks at this point. So How are you feeling about quarterback? Are we letting things slide as no quarterback goes as Joe Mixon goes off the board?
I think we probably want to let the QBs keep going. They could get wiped out in between, but the names at the top, I'm not that interested in. I prefer to see how far Pickett falls, especially with both of his guys still available in Deontay Johnson and George Pickens. I think Terry McLaurin is at least a vaguely interesting pick here, even though we are not particularly high on him. You can get him, obviously, with Sam Howell. Chris Godwin is pretty easily the best wide receiver available purely in a vacuum. This feels like a wide receiver pick to me, Colm.
Yeah, and I think Godwin is the pick in terms of player. The interesting part is if we want to see if we can push Pickett into another round or two down, and we have Johnson and Pickens as potential options to go with him. I'm good with whichever way you want to go. As you mentioned, in a vacuum, Godwin is the play.
So we'll go Godwin there, and that relieves a little bit of concern that we might have about the balance or about being able to get to the receivers that we need in a draft, that as drafters start to get comfortable with some of their other selections, you would expect the position to get wiped out. Christian Kirk goes right after us, then Aaron Rodgers. Donnie Hula-Bowling does pass at QB again and takes Jackson Smith and Jigba.
I think we have two teams here, Shawn, that really want to get us to go in depth in our review show of this draft here. They're really pushing out the boat at the draft structure here.
Well, we have two really fun teams from that perspective. And when you have a Justin Jefferson, Austin Eckler, Breece Hall, Keenan Allen, Jerry Jeudy, JSN team, I mean, that's the brand right there. Those are all of the most highly recommended guys. I think that is a lot of fun, and we can probably expect to be battling them as well for our favorite QB. So there'll be a little bit of a game of chicken there as we get here now into round 7, 8, 9, and 10. It'll be interesting to see if the work outing takes a QB at the 6-7 turn, just Jalen Hurts right there. Colm, we are now into a situation where I believe 8 teams are up to the 2 quarterbacks. And so the element that's alleviating a little bit of the pressure is these 2 teams that don't have any quarterbacks at all.
Yeah, it's easing a bit of the pressure on us because there's some quarterback options available. It made it a little bit tempting to go for the quarterback position at a few rounds here, but there is still plenty of quarterbacks that we will be intrigued. But that is the challenge for us, Shawn, as we talked about when we started it. We kind of knew wide receiver is going to go early, but we also know that the favorite players that we talk about, I would imagine that there's quite a number of the guys drafting in this that have Shawn's rankings pulled up on rotoviz.com, and they're just deciding at which round to take these players. So kind of that is an interesting challenge, because the likes of a Kenny Pickett, who we mentioned, like Aaron Rodgers falling as far as he did, maybe not that surprising, as we haven't talked a lot about Rodgers this offseason outside of the move obviously to the New York Jets and how things would settle there. But the likes of a Kenny Pickett you could see going a little bit earlier. The likes of a Sam Howell could go a little bit earlier. So that's what's going to make it very, very intriguing for us, because we're talking about the wide receiver position and getting priced out there, and that could happen because so far we have 2 wide receivers through those 6 rounds. But there is a chance then that if we're holding off on quarterback to such a point that we also get nipped out of that position. So this is going to be a fun couple of rounds here as we see what happens through the next 3, and then we'll be able to plan and process through the last 10 rounds after that. Shawn, we are 4 selections away from our pick as Terry McLaurin, Marquise Brown, and Darren Waller go off at the turn along with Aaron Jones. For me at this point, those Pittsburgh Steelers wide receivers are very interesting. After that, I think you're dropping down into the DeAndre Swift kind of tier. Dotson and Burke's interesting as well, but I think for me that the Pittsburgh wide receivers would be the priority target here. Is that how you're feeling, or are you interested in one of those other names, or potentially even the quarterbacks?
Right. We don't really know how far the QBs are going to fall. Russell Wilson, Jordan Love, both still available.
Kenny Pickett's gone.
Those guys are from rounds 4 and round 5. Now, Pickett did just go. There'll be a little bit of a gamble for Donnie Hula Bowling. Again, that's the perfect team as we kind of talk through it, to see if either of the two Steelers receivers get back for him. I don't know that you necessarily have to have that, right? The stacks are nice, but what you want to do is build the perfect team in a vacuum as well. Once the Pickett is gone here, it does become a little bit interesting. Teams could start to look for the third quarterback here. We have one team out of the 9th position that is drafted 3. We have the team out of 11 that is drafted 0. If we pass, I think that you have a very strong chance of having the 7-11 and the 802 being a QB hit right there. So these quarterbacks who look pretty fun right now and look like good values in terms of Wilson and Love, they could get wiped out, but we're also into the range where guys like Purdy, Ritter, and Howell are probably going to go. Colm, the other question then would be how comfortable you feel with Stroud and Bryce Young.
At this point or later?
For later.
I feel at this point I'm much more comfortable taking one of the Pittsburgh wide receivers than taking a quarterback. And
you still like them with Pickett off the board?
Yeah.
Do you have
you a different priority you can overrule here?
Well, I always miss on Jahan Dotson. He's here.
Well, now let's go. You don't have to sell me on Dotson. I'm thinking if I say Dotson, you're saying let's wait, another round here for him.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and we'll do a little bit of a reach here. We'll take Jahan Dotson.
You don't have to talk me into Dotson. I'm just trying to read minds as well. We'll see what happens. I think that again with the do you think Dotson in this maybe because we have talked him up quite a bit recently, do you think he would have went ahead off the other two?
No, but one of the things that happens there is
you're thinking about Sam Howell in a couple of rounds time.
Well, with McLaurin at the 6-12, if we take Dotson there, it's a little bit less appealing for one of the drafters in the back half here to go after a Howell. So the thing that you do with Dotson is that in addition to getting a guy that you like, you know that you're not going to be able to get the Steelers stack, you possibly make Sam Howell a little bit less expensive. But Colm, I still think we have to take him next round if we want him. I don't think that he would make it past the 8-9 turn. That team only has one QB. They have Terry McLaurin. It's an OT listener league draft. I mean, really, Dotson, all that he does for us from that perspective is maybe increase the chances he gets back to 8.
Let's see what happens then over the rest of the round here. So far, Shawn, we have Burrow, Taylor, Higgins, Stevenson, Pitts, Godwin, and then Dotson. So after having just one wide receiver through 5 rounds, we now have 2 wide receivers, extras, or 3 wide receivers at this point. Pretty happy with how things are playing out. To give us a lot of flexibility as the rest of the draft continues. Obviously in the Superflex format, a little bit light at the quarterback, but we have lots of options as quarterbacks have fallen a little bit in this draft, but they also, we're in a zone here now where there's a lot of guys that we do like. So we'll see what plays out over those last couple of picks, Shawn. At the back end of the draft, you are correct. At that 7 turn, we get Russell Wilson going off the board. We get Kyler Murray going off the board. We get Bryce Young going off the board. Young was one of the players that you mentioned in the last round when we were at the Dotson pick. I know it was for a later consideration, but he is now no longer there. You mentioned taking Dotson with the hope that maybe that allows Howell to get back to us in this round. We'll see if that turns out to be correct. George Pickens just goes off the board. The other part of the conversation was those Pittsburgh Steelers wide receivers in that last round. So Deontay Johnson and Pickens now off the board, but the likes of DeAndre Swift still available. As the draft picks have gone on, I think, the Dotson pick, I'm still good with that selection over the Steelers wide receivers. But the part that you mentioned about potentially playing out to get Howell back, is Howell the clear-cut pick for you if he makes it another 3 selections?
I think so. Although there are names here that are tough to pass on. Mike Evans would then give us the setup to take both Baker Mayfield, and then you're hoping to get Kyle Trask in the final round. DeAndre Swift, someone who would add a lot more running back firepower. But I'm thinking potentially Howell here, and then Colm. I think it would also be interesting to, with the guys that we would have at that point with Pitts, to get our 3 QB build through Desmond Ridder in round 9. So it's not just thinking through what we would give up in round 8, but potentially also what we would give up in round 9. What are your thoughts on kind of projecting out into the 9th round and hitting a QB double tap here?
Yeah, I think that might be the way to go. I was very much in consideration when you mentioned Mike Evans. He goes one pick ahead of us. The other player here that's really in play for me, Shawn, would be potentially DeAndre Swift. But if it's not Swift, I think we're in a real quarterback zone here. And we may not get the option to double tap a quarterback in the next round, but I'm between Swift and a quarterback, so I'll let you take the controls. Have you a strong preference either way?
Well, we can't do the first OT Listener League draft and grab Dotson and then not select Sam Howell. It wouldn't feel right. So we're going to take Howell here. We're going to.
What you're saying is for the brand. This is
for the brand, for the win, right?
And the other thing is what I am quite surprised about, and this is Sam Howell. We take him in the mid 6th round. He has an ADP, the mid 8th round. He is an ADP off the 8-11. So it's not a case there that we have, outlandishly reached on him. We have reached at the wide receiver to get Dotson, but based on how the draft is played out, not really a reach in terms of wide receiver rankings. So yeah, Sam Howell is the way to go. I'm open to the double tap, Shawn, in the next round. I don't think it's a necessity. I think having that second quarterback now and Howell allows us to go in the direction that the draft board allows. So if somebody happens to continue to slide down the board, we'll be able to go in that direction. So I'm quite happy with how we played that out with the Dotson pick into the Howell pick. I think that worked out very well.
The other thing that we look at here now, and for the video folks, you can see it on the draft board. For the listeners who aren't watching on YouTube, we are up to every team having 2 QBs except for 2, and those will be the teams in the 103 coming back here and the 101. They will definitely get their choice of some of these players who have fallen. Jordan Love still available. Colm, you didn't make the case for your Green Bay Packers when we were on the clock.
No, I didn't. And the reason was I was kind of interested at the point where we did Chris Godwin. I was thinking, Godwin, maybe even Christian Watson at that point of the draft. That was in the mid 6th round. Watson did go 3 selections ahead. So, you could go the Love pick and then, try and pair him up with Dobbs later on. But I know the stacking isn't essential, Shawn, but when it can be done at ADP with players that you have already drafted, I think it makes sense to take the Howell approach to get Dotson there over, the one-off of having Love and then potentially not having it paired with anything later on. Now, I do feel with the Packers, maybe if you even have an Aaron Jones, but if you don't have one of those 2 first wide receivers and Dobbs or Watson, I think it gets very, very hard to put anything with them unless you're just going naked. That sounds bad, naked Love, but that maybe is a strategy that people will employ this year.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how much he brings to the table as a rusher. He's a big athletic QB, but that's probably not going to be a big element of his scoring profile. He's going to be relying on those receivers. He's going to be relying on the excellent coaching staff and play calling that you get there in Green Bay. Hopefully he will decide to, and we'll get a little bit of a feel, perhaps, how much of this is.
You're going to say the play clock? Is that where we're going? Play clock? Yeah.
If they could run a few more plays, we wouldn't be against that. We wouldn't be against it for Aaron Jones, for A.J. Dillon, for anyone who.
For anybody.
Right. So the Packers have the weakness of an unproven QB, but they get out from under some of the collar of things that Aaron Rodgers was maybe negatively bringing to the table there. Colm, as we think through this round 9 pick, and I think it's a really interesting pick from a tactical perspective, the teams in between our round 9 and round 10 will all have 2 QBs. 2 of them have 3 QBs. We would, though, anticipate some of them thinking in the same direction that we're thinking, where you get up to 3 QBs in round 9, that's the point where you have to do it. We're going to see some of these QBs who have fallen because everyone is playing a little bit of chicken, which is smart. You don't need to be the person who takes the first guy from a tier. You're trying to get to the position where you're taking the last players before tier breaks. But once they run out, they really do run out. So I think that we will have drafters who are going after the 3 QB build, try and get there. Now, 2 of the teams that only have 2 quarterbacks, again, on that side, took either QB or QB running back QB. So basically 2 QBs in the first 3 rounds. As we mentioned from 2021, if we get a scoring profile where the top guys score and you don't get these kind of out of nowhere or out of the deep ADP types of big scoring years, we have reason to believe that just 2 QB probably is the way to go. So there's no guarantee that all of those teams will be looking for a third, but there are enough that if we wait until round 10, I mean, there could be a penalty, but I mean, the thing that I love about OT drafters is they're going to come out of this with an extremely gutsy overall approach. Might be surprised who falls.
Yeah, and the other one, now just to go through the quarterbacks that are available, ranked by current ADP, it's Stroud, Purdy, Garoppolo, Mac Jones, Ritter, Mayfield, Tannehill. Then you're into the Lance bracket, and it gets down into the deep waters at that point. So realistic options left are Stroud, Purdy, Garoppolo, Mac Jones, Ritter, and Mayfield. Maybe Ryan Tannehill as expected starters. So there's not a huge amount of those left, Shawn. But I did mention earlier the possibility of Ritter. You mentioned even like waiting and seeing what happens with Baker Mayfield. At the moment, for me, they're the 2 targets that I would have in mind versus the available quarterbacks that are left. Are they the guys that you have available in your mind? And you mentioned the double tap. Are you still thinking about that? Or are you thinking sliding further down the line? I'm thinking about pushing this further down the line at quarterback.
I think those guys are going to go. The question, I think, would be, do we more or less have Mac Jones in that same tier? And basically, my answer would be yes. I'm really excited about what he brings. He's one of the reasons that I'm doing a lot of late QB builds in non-Superflex formats. I think that's the way to go this season. Obviously, you're taking some risk because you're betting against the community's ranks, but I really like that way to play it. Unfortunately, Colm, the other player I really thought that we had to look at here was Quentin Johnston. He goes 1 spot ahead of us. I don't think that there is an opportunity cost that's meaningful here that would push us to pass on QB. I think this is a pretty clear QB pick.
If you want to go quarterback, I can't make a pitch for Jameson Williams here, no?
Getting the 3rd QB over a guy who's going to miss the first 6 games, I think is the
Which quarterback are you thinking? Is it Ritter?
It's Ritter.
Okay, I'll meet you in the middle.
Okay, so Ritter, Colm was on board for Brock Purdy, Mac Jones.
The other thing, Shawn, that allows as far as I know it's a 3rd stack though. So each of our quarterbacks we have a paired option that puts Ritter in with Kyle Pitts, which again at the price and at the players available at this particular point is another thing that I think is setting this team up pretty well. So just to have a recap, and then we'll get Shawn's thoughts. Is our quarterbacks so far are Joe Burrow, Sam Howell, Ritter. So we're betting into that second year, players stepping up that, again, we can say limited either way for sample size or opportunities last season as rookies, but I think there should be a lot more to it this year. We'll at least get to see if they sink or swim. We have Sam Howell and Ritter as those second options. And then we have Jonathan Taylor, Ramondre Stevenson at running back, T. Higgins, Chris Godwin, Jahan Dotson at wide receiver, and Kyle Pitts then at tight end. If Quentin Johnston had lasted 1 more pick, Shawn, are we at our 4th wide receiver versus our 2nd quarterback, our 3rd quarterback, I guess is my question. And then the last part is how are you feeling overall about the start and the kind of flexibility it should let us have moving forward here in the rest of this draft?
Yeah, if Quentin Johnston is still there, I think we push it and see what the other drafters do. His upside is just so immense. But Colm, I have to say that I love this build. You mentioned that we have receivers or the tight end with Pitts to go with all 3 of the quarterbacks. That gives us more outs when we think of advancing through those playoff weeks. The ideal advancement now through the tournament would be to have different players hit in different weeks so that we don't have huge overlap with the other finalists. That's something to think about. I love the fact that you have those 2 star running backs and Jonathan Taylor and Ramondre Stevens. I love the fact that we have 3 wide receivers, even in this wide receiver heavy draft, that we feel very confident and very strongly about. We've taken that risk on Kyle Pitts, but we've put it with this idea that Desmond Ridder and the Falcons are going to emerge as a more exciting and competent team in 2023. One of the things that is sort of implied, but we do want to go back to from time to time and think about here when we're building these best ball tournament teams, as your team needs to tell a story that is a coherent story and is internally consistent, will allow you to win a tournament if things go right. I think that this is the perfect style of team for that. Maybe it's a team that has a little better chance of finishing either in the top 2 or in the bottom half. I mean, we're drafting with elite drafters here from the OT community, so maybe a little more chance to fit in the bottom half than usual. But if your structure works, even when you miss on a lot of things, you'd be surprised how high you finish. But again, the goal is to win. And I think that this is the type of team that wins tournaments.
So since that last selection, Shawn, it is Zay Flowers, Brandon Cooks, Damian Pierce, CJ Stroud, Dalvin Cook, who obviously recently released by the Vikings. We get Javonte Williams, Jameson Williams, Samaje Perine, and then James Conner. So over those last 7 picks, we've got 5 running backs off the board. So a little bit of a running back run there. It is an interesting area, Shawn, as we approach this section of the draft. For me, this would be an ideal spot for targeting that third. Basically, the dream scenario here was to get Quentin Johnson, then to get Ridder here, but obviously that's not going to be possible. We are now into that 10th round. A little bit of a potential flat area here coming up in the draft. Who are some of the prime targets here for you? I think there's a couple over the next 2-3 rounds. You mentioned this, I don't know if it was in the preview show or on this show, some interest in tight ends in this zone, some interest in potential 0 running back kind of characters in here, the likes of a Charbonnet, maybe a Khalil Herbert. We talked a little bit about the Packers. We have AJ Dillon in here, Rashad White. There's a couple of names in here that could potentially be interesting, but tight ends then the likes of Dulcich, Laporta, Everett, that go over these next couple of rounds. How are you thinking about playing out here over the next, say, 2 rounds or 3 rounds?
Well, Tim took the 2 guys we really wanted there at the turn in Javonte Williams and Jameson Williams.
Thanks, Tim, for that.
Yeah, that could hurt him when we talk about being able to make it through, right?
Yeah.
And yet, those are the upside plays that win tournaments. I think you have to like it from that perspective. Colm, when I'm looking here, this is a flat area. I do think that Elijah Moore is well separated from everybody else. He's a guy who was fantastic in college, had extremely impressive peripherals as a rookie, and then gets just absolutely destroyed by not just the play of Zach Wilson, but also then the politics that he gets into with his team. He moves now. I think he's got a great chance to outscore Amari Cooper this season. I think he's pretty straightforwardly a couple rounds above everybody else on my board.
Okay, and we'll take him. He's somebody that Shawn has mentioned on a number of podcasts recently. Did Shawn have one of the YouTube videos where somebody did not agree that he was going to outscore Amari Cooper this year, let's just say, but I think there is a good possibility of that. And the thing here is the range of outcomes. There's a chance that Elijah Moore, ends up getting cut and isn't on the roster come week 1, but there's a stronger chance that he is there, and he is at minimum the wide receiver 2 on this offense. So we have seen his talent. We've seen since he came into the NFL, but he's been in a tough situation with the Jets and how things have played out here. And last year was a little bit just of a train wreck for his entire season, but we'll see how it plays out. When we look at players, Shawn, by ADP that were available there, I mentioned some of the running backs, even the likes of a Dalton Schultz, Dalton Kincaid are in that range, Brian Robinson. So there is other options, but at wide receiver, like you mentioned, he was by ADP the 3rd wide receiver. So when we're looking at how the board is running through the wide receiver position at this particular point, Juju Smith-Schuster was the next wide receiver. Then we had Michael Thomas. Then we had Elijah Moore. Those other 2 guys still available, but the wide receivers available at this point to run down the list a little bit further is Lazard, Odell Beckham Jr., Rashee Rice, Jacoby Myers. Then you're into Zay Jones, Adam Thielen, Sky Moore. So there's a little bit of a tail off there. So I think that's a smart place to take that, to give us that additional wide receiver, see what happens then with some of those running back names potentially that I mentioned coming back to us. But it is a little bit of a flat zone, so there is going to be points here where we are going to be taking that little reach forward to see what happens and who we take. So let's see how it's going to play out. Since our pick, we get White off the board. That's Rashad White, Khalil Herbert, Mac Jones, and then we get Isaiah Pacheco, Brock Purdy. Tight end, Shawn, might be a play here in this next round, or again, are you looking to push that out a little bit?
No, I think if Dalton Kincaid comes back around, that becomes very interesting. We're not going to end up with a lot of him in all likelihood, and yet this would be the right format and the right draft probably to get him in, and then we're not that far away from a real run of potentially dynamic tight ends. Colm, we have to point out here that, I mean, what we guessed, which is that some of these drafters who hadn't gone QB early would take them on the back half. That turned out not to be true. As you mentioned, CJ Stroud, the only guy who went. They come back through, and the teams out of the 101 and the 103 who waited on QB, this was a magical run for them. Donnie, who loved bowling, gets Mac Jones as his third QB. The work outing gets Brock Purdy and Jimmy Garoppolo as their second and third QBs. Those teams have gained so much value by having the guts to wait at the QB position and then hitting on guys who just make a lot of sense late. I just don't have that much of a gap between those players and the guys who are going in, say, round 4.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And that has worked out. It's going to be interesting, when the draft is over, to recap some of these teams to see how the strategies played out as the draft boards progressed here. But the last couple of rounds, Shawn, have been very thought-provoking. There's a lot of mental gymnastics to go through to try and really, competing against people who, as I mentioned before, know your thoughts, kind of know the steps that you want to take, and they're plotting it out ahead of you. So as that little bit of extra intrigue, a little bit more of a challenge to what we're trying to do here. But you mentioned some of the dynamic tight ends that may be coming up. There is some wide receivers in here who are of interest, but I really feel like there's a potential here if Kincaid lasts that we could see a tight end back-to-back, or 2 tight ends in the next 3 rounds here potentially, because I could see a run coming up at the tight end position. But I do feel like this is a zone where running back and tight end are very interesting. There's a couple of wide receivers. I mentioned Rice, Myers. Then I think, Zay Jones had a great season last year. A little bit more competition there with Ridley this season. But then you're into, the conversation with Rice, and also with Sky Moore would be, the week 17 match versus the Bengals, who we obviously have Burrow and T. Higgins. So I think it's getting quite interesting here. And I mentioned Dobbs earlier. So are they kind of the players that you're looking at here at wide receiver, and then the rest are going to be running backs or tight ends over the next 3 rounds?
Well, really, I don't know that I like anybody here at receiver. I prefer to target guys who are pretty late. I mean, Rashee Rice and Sky Moore, both vaguely in this next group. We wouldn't be surprised at all if a receiver from the Chiefs broke out, and it would be a great fit with our Bengals players there. Dobbs, somebody who has been generating some internal buzz with the Packers. I think that portion of it is interesting. But Colm, this to me looks like a running back and tight end area. We're going to get one of the 2 guys that I really want here. Now, Charbonnet was an interesting kind of contrarian pick where his ADP is in the 10th. He goes in the 11th. We come back through here, though, and the other running back that I really like is Rashad Penny. When we think about someone who, could put up almost 100 points across the 3 playoff weeks, I mean, Penny is a name that jumps out. The thing that did just happen, though, is Sam Laporta went. We know that Dalton Kincaid is not going to last far beyond that. I think that taking the running back here with some of the other tight end options, and because we went Kyle Pitts early, is probably the way to go. But if you have a strong preference for Kincaid, I can certainly see that.
No, that's the way to go. I think I was hoping Laporta wasn't going to go there. I was hoping that we would see him push down, because I was targeting him in that next round, hopefully. But when we look at the running backs that are available, it's AJ Dillon, Brian Robinson, Antonio Gibson, who is also interesting. Gibson, we'll see what happens when we get back in that next round if he happened to be there and the tight ends aren't there. But then you're into Jamal Williams, Damian Harris again, who's a little bit interesting, Kendry Miller, Jerick McKinnon. But you're starting to really start to drop down some tiers then when it's getting into this point. So I think looking there, I think AJ Dillon, depending on what the Packers will do this year, has the potential to maybe have a similar effect to Penny. But I think Penny's upside in that Eagles offense is really, really high. And obviously we love DeAndre Swift, but I think there's been much worse running backs than both of those guys in that backfield, scoring a lot of fantasy points over the last couple of years. And we also know that both of those guys struggle to stay healthy. So if it ends up being one of those guys being the main man, and at certain points, the upside is just huge.
So Penny, with the just crazy peripherals every season, the ability to break tackles, the ability to break long runs in that Eagles offense, if he were to stay healthy, as you mentioned, if we get some games where it's one or the other. The other thing here, Colm, is just that Boston Scott and Kenneth Gainwell probably not completely going away. And I mean, there may
this roster is going to have 10 running backs on it come week 1.
Well, I mean, those 4 guys are going to definitely be an issue. That 2022 season would suggest that you're going to have some drives where Penny and Swift alternate with electric 20 and 25 yard runs. The Eagles don't pass at all, destroying the hearts and minds of all the A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith managers. And then they're going to get down to the 1 yard line, and Boston Scott or Kenneth Gainwell is going to come in.
You got to get Boston Scott in on the goal line when you can.
You've got to. And then just everyone on earth is upset about that particular drive from the Eagles. But if you score enough points, there are a lot of points to go around. We're going to bet on elite talents. We're going to bet on them having the right timing in any given year to win us a tournament. Again, I love the tournament element of the players that we've selected so far. And again, I would go back to saying Elijah Moore, just an undervalued player.
Shawn, as we do these drafts, obviously we're on the FFPC and the dashboard and so on the website. I can see the comments coming through from some of the questions, but I have seen a number of people saying that they're watching the clock and we're running down to 0-0-1 here a lot, but they have the understanding that it's just to try and see if I can get in some thoughts for the picks as you filibuster. But I think today we've the big advantage on the FFPC versus the Underdog side is we both have access to the draft. So for anyone out there feeling concerned or sorry for me today, don't worry. It's a really pleasant draft experience. The tricky part of these drafts is not the clock running out; it's the competition that we're drafting against. So this has been a pleasure so far. We are 3 picks away, though, Shawn. Since our last selection is Mayfield, Tannehill, we get Everett, Dalton Schultz, AJ Dillon, Antonio Gibson. I'm just holding out here. There's 1 pick to go, Shawn. One name here that I'm not going to say has not gone off the board. It's Michael Thomas, Trey Lance, Jacoby Myers, Damian Harris, Chigs Okonkwo. Kincaid hasn't gone off the board, Shawn. Will he make it this 1 more pick? I think if he does, I think that has to be the selection.
It would be a little bit crazy, but I mean, you get those drafts from time to time. Okonkwo is somebody who has an ADP in that same. Oh, and we do get Kincaid at that spot. So not a surprise. Not a surprise. That was the pick that made sense there. But Colm, we do have to now go down to the next kind of batch of players. I don't know that any names jump out once Kincaid is off the board.
No, and you mentioned at the last pick not being overly intrigued at the wide receiver options, but that is kind of where it feels like we are into here. The only other player, Shawn, at tight end, there is 2 tight ends, but it's Cole Kmet and Greg Dulcich that I would make a pitch for here if we want to stick to tight end.
Yeah, I don't think it's ever too early to hit someone like Kendry Miller, who's another type of win the whole thing type of selection. But Dulcich in his own way, probably a better selection than Kincaid. You could argue that maybe there'll be less competition. Are you okay with Dulcich here?
Yeah.
So Dulcich also, I mean, very similar types of players in terms of how they're build coming into the NFL. We watched last year how when Dulcich was healthy, he was extremely dynamic, Coaching staff loved him. They forced some targets to him. He scores some touchdowns, gets hurt again. Then there was this question of, with the new coaching staff, was he going to have the same role? You have Albert O there, and anytime the coaches get to see him and his athleticism and fluidity at the tight end position, they're pretty blown away. But as OTAs have occurred, some practices have happened, coaches have gotten to see Dulcich from the new Sean Payton staff. They seem to be, again, blown away by Dulcich. In a lot of ways, it's really taking that same type of pick and getting the guy who has the year's experience and will be ready to potentially make that jump. I talk all the time about Blair's research on breakout performance and when we would expect to get that. You do get that a lot from second-year tight ends. And I mean, Dulcich is the style of player where if it breaks the right way, we could be looking at a game plan here that is very much a Jerry Jeudy, Dulcich, and then hopefully Marvin Mims. This team could be far more dynamic as a result, emphasizing those guys. The question always comes back to Russell Wilson and if he is as washed as he looked last year. Again, it's not just one thing that he does wrong. He has a lot of issues with being a competent NFL quarterback at this point. He's going to be managed better by the new coaching staff. You're going to get better play calling, and yet just managing a quarterback, it's the NFL, right? If the guy can't play, he can't play. It's going to be a problem. That's the thing that we're hoping to see, because obviously we have some exposure to those other names that I mentioned as well.
Yeah, I would agree on all of that. And Dulcich is somebody who I feel should be going, ahead of this tier. The reason they're so interested in Kincaid is that is, almost a 2.5 round discount in terms of where his ADP went. He went behind a lot of tight end players there that he would be usually ahead of. So would have been very hard to pass him up. Dulcich is one of my key tight end targets when we're getting into this kind of 11 through 13 range. I did mention Komet, who is interesting. Michael Meyer just went off the board. We get Laporta. So we get a lot of these young guys, I guess, who haven't either had the chance to prove it in the NFL or haven't proven it. And we've seen, like, for example, Okonkwo last year, some really, really nice games, as somebody coming into the NFL. So we'll see what he can do this season. But there's a few names in here that I think can be in that ascending. We're starting to get a lot of veterans in that elite tier, the likes of Kelsey, Andrews, Kittle, even Hawkinson leaning towards that now. Darren Waller still going in the 6th round. A lot of more veteran players, Evan Ingram, for example. So we could see a lot of these guys start to push up if they have big performances this year and overtake some of those names that I did mention. So yeah, I think nice there to pair him with Pitts. We'll see then what we can do throughout the rest of the draft here, what other options come up at tight end. But I think it was a nice spot to get a tight end on the board. Looking, Shawn, then you mentioned Miller. He may get back to us here, and I think if he gets back to us, it's going to be hard to pass him up at this particular moment in time. All those wide receivers that we can, not all of them, but the two Kansas City guys is more what I'm trying to say that we were talking about with the stacking element of it. Rice and Moore, they are both still available. Rashawn Johnson, Brian Robinson kind of in this zone. So we are going to have options. We're one pick away. Marvin Mims, Zay Jones, Rondell Moore, all going off the board as well. That's an interesting kind of trio of wide receivers in the 13th round of a draft like this to have an opportunity to get on your roster as well. We won't have that opportunity, but yeah, interesting there. The last 4 wide receivers, Shawn kind of touched on some of the names earlier, but Jacoby Myers, Dobbs, and those 3, that 12th, 13th round, and this is 12th and 13th round in this draft. You're probably getting those guys just a little bit later in a regular draft, but nice names to have the option to get in a draft like this.
Yeah, you're going to have some players like Mims and Moore who are going earlier here, and they're going to just roar up the board in this FFPC Superflex format over the next month. So you shouldn't worry when you select them early in your particular draft. Colm, I think that the Sky Moore selection with the potential second-year breakout is really interesting there. It would be surprising if he does absolutely nothing for them this season, and that pick makes sense structurally in 2 ways, in that adding to the receiving core is something that we need to do. So between him and Miller, I think those are probably the 2 main names that we're looking at right here.
Yeah, have you more well ahead of Rice in terms of who you want for the Chiefs?
With similar elements to their profile, it just seems like taking the guy who's been there has already gone through the growing pains probably makes the most sense.
Let's do it. The challenge of a draft like this, and each pick that goes by, I'm find that itch to try and find a wide receiver that we can draft. When we go through it, with Jonathan Taylor, with Stevenson, we are now 13 picks through the draft. That was somewhere where we could have potentially gone with Miller, who we talked about at the previous pick, but that would have left us with just 4 wide receivers through 13 selections. So when you have 3 quarterbacks in there, when you have 2 tight ends, and then you have your 3. Like we've only drafted the 3 running backs, but it can make it a little bit tricky to flesh out that wide receiver position. So, Miller goes off the board. You mentioned Miller earlier, Shawn, and you're always much more in touch and in tune with these rookies and what to fully expect them coming into the NFL. What is your keynotes on Miller here for 2023?
Well, Miller is extremely controversial, and that a lot of college football watchers think that he has the big playability, that profile, that athleticism where he can stop and get going again, get to full speed very quickly. He has the long speed. And then there are a bunch of scouts who think that he's a little bit more of a grinder, a little bit more of a plotter, somebody who benefited from TCU's offense. Because we don't have testing on him with the injury, it's hard to really add too much onto that, especially again when he only has the one big year there for TCU with playing behind Zach Evans the previous season. Now he's very young coming into the NFL. That's a big deal. His performance last year was elite. The peripherals with the broken tackle numbers, the evasion rate, those things are very encouraging. And then he goes into this offense where he's going to have a chance to play with a team where you have Jamal Williams, who's just a guy, and you have Alvin Kamara, who it seems like has a chance for a huge suspension, right? If it ends up being a 3 or 4 game suspension, it's probably not a big deal. If it ends up being an 8 game suspension, then you have a chance for Miller to take the lead role and never look back. You want to be a little bit careful that you don't start drafting him in every single draft. That's one of the reasons why he passed on him here. But he is one of those guys where when things break the right way, you're looking at league-winning upside.
The Kamara suspension, that seems to be something that is ongoing. I know it's not. It feels like that has been ongoing forever at this point, but it isn't really. But we should have some outcomes on it, hopefully, in the near future. But Shawn, 2 more selections before we get to us. We do see, since that last pick, Brian Robinson, Odell Beckham, Kendry Miller, who you discussed, Juju Smith-Schuster, Irv Smith, Rashee Rice, Trey McBride, Mingo, Nico Collins, then Michael Gallup, Tanks Bigsby. 1 more pick before we go. Mike Gesicki in the queue, Rashawn Johnson in the queue, Taquan Thornton, who's always a favorite, in the queue. By playing the ADP game, it feels like this one really should be Johnson. Somebody who's always been a favorite, Shawn, and we haven't really talked about this year. Devin Singletary kind of goes in this range. He's now down with the Houston Texans. Any hope for our boy Devin Singletary in 2023 as we are on the clock now as Jaylen Warren goes off the board?
There's hope. There's always hope. But he's not in the conversation here, I don't think. We're looking at probably Mike Gesicki, Tyquan Thornton, Curtis Samuel. The player I really wanted to get back through, and probably we should have just taken instead of Sky Moore in the last round, was Trey McBride. That would have given us the 3 tight ends that you really need to make your structure work in this format. The more tight ends, the better, especially if those guys can score, which we think that Trey McBride probably would have. Mike Gesicki, a much more controversial pick in some ways, and yet his path to playing time straightforward, his athleticism off the charts. Supposedly he's flashed in a huge way in OTAs. He is more expensive here than he is in some other formats, so you might just target him in those formats. But Colm, we need a 3rd tight end. Gesicki, Thornton, Samuel, we've got 10 seconds.
Let's go with Thornton.
So
I mentioned if there's still hope for Singletary. I know you think there's still hope for Mike Gesicki, but we must be getting that candle must be getting burnt pretty thin at this point for that.
So you're out on Gesicki.
I'm not out, but I've been in a long time. I do think there's still hope. I guess I'm just not as in. That offense last year, we had such high hopes that he was going to kind of fit into the Shanahan offense kind of a style and fit in as the Kittle. And we know how frustrating it has been sometimes for Kittle for games that he may not see targets, but that was a tough run last year for Mike Gesicki. I do think it's interesting. The one thing, Shawn, that knocked me off it there, and I don't know if this would matter at all to you, is the week 11 bye with Kyle Pitts would have been matched up, and then that would leave us with the, Dulcich. If anything happens, you're taking a 0 there. Is that something that you're looking at here at this particular point? I do have some names still that I like at tight end after that point was the other reason. And when we look at wide receiver, there's some interesting ones, but nothing that's really leaping out. The one that I was also tempted by there was Curtis Samuel, and that obviously would pair into the Dotson Howell Samuel side of things. But I think you wanted to go Gesicki there, and he goes in the next pick. Thornton.
Well, I think we should have taken Trey McBride in round 13 and not risked it. Then it would have not been really an issue. I guess I don't have other names other than Noah Fant late. And
Noah Fant is
he seems a lot more blocked than Gesicki is. So we'll see kind of how that portion of it develops. It is good to have a target who will go very late, which Fant probably will. His ADP is in round 17. Again, you get a lot of tight ends drafted in this because of the tight end premium, because they are so viable for that flex spot. And because if you get locked out of the top guys, you need a lot of volume to make sure you just don't get completely destroyed at the tight end spot in isolation. So we're going to see tight ends continue to go here.
Yeah. With the block, do you think Hunter Henry is not somebody who's going to potentially block? I just think we've seen this over the years with the Patriots, that it gets so murky with positions. They're just filled with wide receivers. They're filled with a couple of tight ends there as well. I just don't know if we see him just completely wipe out Hunter Henry, who was a red zone target for them last year.
And I think Hunter Henry, you mentioning that's a good point. He's somebody who is more or less not going. He's got a 19th round ADP. That part I think is also absurd. With the offense being more functional this season, we would expect him to bounce back. He's a good late pick, probably a better pick in relation to ADP than Gesicki is. The two guys basically play different positions. So the question always comes down to whether Gesicki's position is going to factor into the offense. Because they really only have Tyquan Thornton and Gesicki as dynamic threats, I think that it will, but the concerns that you raise always valid with someone like a Mike Gesicki. So you kind of talked me around to it. I think that we have Fant and Henry as interesting options late. Luke Musgrave, your Green Bay reach pick.
Shawn, there's one other name that I always pitch in here, and Shawn's never taken me up on it yet as somebody who could have anything at the tight end position. Shawn, who is that name?
I guess I'm not even really sure. So I don't like the rest of the names here.
It's Otten.
Oh, okay.
We have to get on the Otten train.
How long? This is a team that has two of the best receivers in the entire NFL and no QB.
One of the worst quarterbacks.
So it doesn't seem like a great situation for him. So Curtis Samuel does go. That was the name I was really looking at there. We get Donnie Who Love Bowling wipes out both Chuba and Curtis. So
Johnny Who Loves Bowling has certainly got his airtime on this episode of the show.
Well, because it's the perfect draft. So that's what gets you in there. Colm, that puts us in a little bit more of an under pressure situation here. I think that Wandale is interesting, might not come back around. Roshan Johnson has stayed out there. He's someone who, maybe third in the pecking order right now, but it's not hard to envision a scenario where he is the running back one for the Bears, and that the Bears running backs are averaging 6 yards a carry. He's someone we could look at. Other names that might pop up to you?
I think they're the ones that are in play. The other name I haven't seen talked about much at all this offseason, come back from injuries, Darnell Mooney. Obviously, they have more there as well, but he has really fallen off in terms of where his ADP was last year. You mentioned Wendell Robinson possibly not getting around. I think that's a fair part of the conversation, but I think Johnson stands out for the price at this point.
And he does allow us to address running back. When you're in a wide receiver heavy room, it's easy to be really focusing on the wide receivers and lose track of the fact that actually that's not where your positional need is, right? We're up to 6 wide receivers. That was only our 4th running back. Colm, Devin Singletary goes 1 pick after. He was the other name that we probably should have been looking at right there. But I like having a guy in Johnson who, even though we were mildly skeptical of his prospect profile and someone who never really took a major step behind Bijan Robinson, the fact that he goes to the Bears and then suddenly nobody cares when he was one of the trendiest backs pre-NFL draft. I mean, I think that the trendiness was probably a little overstated. I also think getting him at these prices is a little bit odd. It's certainly something that at least presents some upside.
Yeah, and I think when we're looking at some of these rookies at this point, like there's a lot of names that are going to go in this range that are, we're looking at players who may return value, in the 5th round at a 13th round ADP. But when you're looking at some of these rookie options, you're looking for players that are going to absolutely smash, and he kind of fits in to that for me. I think that the Bears, we can't be completely bought in. We obviously like Justin Fields, but there's still a lot of questions around how the passing game is going to develop there, for example. But I think the run game has a huge amount of potential. The other name, Shawn, though, for me, that is very hard there to pass up, and I was going to get your thoughts on it, is Roschon Johnson is going right at the same kind of spot as Deontay Foreman. Then Khalil Herbert's obviously going that little bit earlier than both of those guys. How do you think that depth chart is going to shake out? It feels to me like Foreman has as good a chance as anyone to win out that backfield. I think then in PPR leagues, that's why you're looking here at Herbert going that little bit earlier.
I agree with you from a talent perspective. I do think that when you have a guy that the staff has seen play and he's that dynamic, that they already know what he brings. And they're thinking, now we need depth behind him or in addition to him. So then you look at it as, what's the difference between a free agent selection and a draft pick? In both cases, the team has said, this is a guy that we like. But when you're talking about a young player that a team uses a draft pick on, as opposed to a player who is simply added for not very much money in free agency, you have a bigger statement, I think, in the draft. You have a young guy, the younger players, the players with the widest range of outcomes because we don't know what they're going to do yet at the NFL level. I think that those are the guys who have the slight edge. Now, I think that Herbert clearly has the edge overall and should be going first, but I do like taking Roschon as the second player, even though Foreman is someone who came into the NFL as a better prospect, I think, than people realized. And then he fought through all of the things that happened to him. He came back and is now an above average NFL running back. And yet, I mean, really signing with the Bears was about as bad a spot as he could have ended up in terms of how everything worked out in the end.
Yeah, and again, when we're looking at, I know there's a chance that he has a great season, not as Foreman I'm talking about, but we're looking at players who, when we get to 2023, the ADP could just be completely different for them. Like Foreman's a 27-year-old running back, going to be 28 next year. That's not going to be the case for him, but if Johnson comes in and hits over 1,000 yards here, we can see him move up quite considerably for next year. And again, that's somebody who could lead into being that league winner for you. Since that pick, Shawn, it's Singletary, Thielen, Mooney, Hyatt, Hayden Hurst, Raheem Mostert, Foreman himself goes off the board. Then Taysom Hill, Donovan Peoples-Jones, Rashid Shaheed. Then we get Josh Downs. So we're one selection away at this point, Shawn. Wendell Robinson is still there, and he makes it to us, which is something I didn't think would happen, and I'm very pleased about. I'm on the Wendell Robinson camp here. We do have some of those tight ends that we mentioned, but are you happy to go Robinson here?
I think it has to be Robinson. I think that at the receiving position, he's more or less the last of the really dynamic options. Now, DJ Chark could be the wide receiver 1 for the Carolina Panthers. Isaiah Hodgins could be the wide receiver 1 for the Giants. And we've had other Giants already selected here. John Mechie could be the wide receiver 1 for the Panthers. And yet you're looking at passing games for those guys where the overall level should just be so low. With Robinson, you're really dealing with that injury. As soon as he is ready to go, he's almost certainly the wide receiver 1 for the Giants. And because he is both an elite underneath threat and someone who can potentially stretch the defense, when we're looking at the second half of the season, and especially now that we're deep into round 16, you can take a little bit more of a risk with some of those plays, or you're thinking to the future a little bit more. I mean, he's the guy, again, who could be a tournament winner. You know, if we get to November and he hasn't played a snap yet, then you're really regretting that pick. And yet, Wan'Dale Robinson, in part, I think, because the fantasy community never really got just how good he was in his final year in college, and that where the Giants technically reached to pick him, I say technically, that's the perception. You had guys like, all of the players from that little group that went later, that Thornton, Pickens, Sky Moore, Alec Pierce group. And Wan'Dale goes ahead of those guys. He probably should have gone ahead of all of those guys other than George Pickens. The Giants add quantity but not quality at the position, and if there's one guy who emerges and becomes the real driver of that offense through the air, I have to think it's Wan'Dale.
Shawn, you mentioned the added quantity. There is certainly a quantity of wide receivers in New York. So here is some of the names. We have Isaiah Hodgson, who, out of all these guys, Hodgson and Robinson are the two that I like the most, but they added Jalen Hyatt in the draft. They have Darius Slayton is still there. Sterling Shepard is still there. Paris Campbell came in from the Colts. Wan'Dale Robinson, Jameis Crowder is coming from the Buffalo Bills. There is a variety of other names that I don't think are going to have an impact. Then they also have Darren Waller added in as well, and Bellinger, who I liked last year as a rookie. There is, I don't know if there's going to be an actual, like what we look at as a true wide receiver one on the Giants. There's probably 2 to 3 of those guys that are kind of some sort of fantasy impact that probably are going to fall in that wide receiver 3 category. But are they the 2 guys for you that are standing out, do you think, when the depth chart settles? Is Hyatt somebody who can push both those guys? There's just so many options in New York. It's a real mismatch of wide receivers.
Well, we're getting some buzz for Darren Waller in the early offseason. And it's easy to forget just how good he was when he was at his peak a couple years ago. It's a weird decision for the Raiders to make, to kind of go in a different direction when they need talent. And yet you get the new coach in there and you want to turn over all the guys. You want to get your guys in there. They now have Michael Mayer, so they've got the young tight end instead of the old tight end. One of the things here is that Darren Waller has a pretty aggressive ADP in round 6 as the tight end 7. I guess I would be just as skeptical about him staying healthy as Wan'Dale. And so for me, that's kind of a tough selection there, even though I love Waller's talent. I think that he might be, the guy who is a threat to Travis Kelce from a talent perspective if everything works properly. But when I'm looking at the Giants and how congested the receiving core is, that's one of those teams where I want to take a high talent guy at a great price. I don't want to risk any of the early prices on the different players. So that's where we get to Robinson. We did like Jalen Hyatt. His peripherals, very, very impressive. His speed, he's somebody who is going to get behind the defense. It's a little bit surprising in a way. We had a lot of great college football analysts on OT during the draft time period, and many of them were skeptical of Jalen Hyatt because of the offense that Tennessee ran. And yet, when you think about what he did to Alabama, I think he's going to be able to do some of that at the NFL level. So Hyatt, definitely an interesting selection as well.
We are a couple of picks away now before it comes back to us again, Shawn. And this is an area, we mentioned some of the potential tight ends that we might like. And although there is other names in front of Henry, I think we can probably still hold off and wait on him. But there's not a huge amount of other names of interest at the tight end position left. Wide receiver, you mentioned DJ Chark previously. He is available as we approach this next selection. And then quite a number of potential running back options. We have the Minnesota Vikings guys in there that are the, McBride and Chandler. Also, Israel Abanakanda's in there. Anyone taking your interest here, Shawn? I don't have a strong lean either way at this point.
I think this probably has to come down to Zach Evans and Chase Brown. And Chase Brown has been the trendier and more popular player. He's the more expensive player by a couple of rounds. The only thought that I have there is that Travion Williams seems to be at least as good a way to play that offense and gives us a guy that we can select late. I don't feel the same way about the Rams, even though there obviously are other names on their depth chart as well.
I'll let you make the call.
So, Colin, we do take Zach Evans there. Just to sort of refresh where we are at the tight end position, we're looking at Hunter Henry and then a couple of deep names in Luke Musgrave and Jelani Woods, because Noah Fant does go at the 16-10. Rookie running backs, I think, are interesting here in Abanikanda and Dwayne McBride. He's someone that everyone should be paying attention to following the release of Dalvin Cook. But in the same way that Travion is perhaps a just simply better way to play the Bengals running back room, and that he has all of that experience. And one of the things that just always pops back out to me is that Travion was an excellent college football player. In doing research for a variety of different articles, we'll be in there playing with the Sports Info Solutions college football tool that we use in a lot of our prospect research, and then working with different models, projecting guys to the NFL. And you go back through and you look at some of the names, and Travion, because he hasn't played hardly at all as an NFL player since he finished at Texas A&M, you're thinking, well, where can the ceiling possibly be? This is a similar situation to Chris Evans, where he was very trendy, but never really does anything. And that's because he is not a true NFL player. Well, Evans was someone who also struggled in college, and it's a difference there to Travion, who was an extraordinary college player. The fact that he has stuck, that we haven't really gotten to see either way. I mean, if he had played at the NFL level and had any meaningful touches and hadn't been good, then we would be out. But he's never really gotten a chance, and yet he's one of these guys who sticks around. And when you have the late round picks stick around and they start to move into a situation where maybe they have a chance, that's where you're looking for these sort of mid to late career breakout guys. Again, the ceiling is probably not the same as other types of players, but in this offense, with what the Bengals do, with the fact that we have a couple of Bengals guys there early, it's pretty appealing, Colin. A couple other names here. Pierre Strong, that number 2 for the Patriots. I mean, you probably like him a little better on a team that doesn't have Ramondre Stevenson, but he is a compelling name. And then the other name, like a Travion, would be Ty Chandler, one of our favorite late picks last year. Never really got the chance with the starter and the backup staying healthy and experiencing some of his own injuries. But he's someone, not quite the college player that Travion was, but after he transferred and we finally gets a good chance there at North Carolina, does a lot with it. He brings some receiving value to the table. He's got sub 4.4 speed. Colin, the guys with sub 4.4 speed, very intriguing. I mean, you need those big plays. It can't all be about volume.
Yeah, pretty fast when you're in that range. Shawn, we have 3 quarterbacks, 2 tight ends, 5 running backs, and that leaves us with 2, 4, 6 wide receivers at this particular point. Are we looking here? We must have a third tight end. Is that what we're looking at? And then Ty Chandler, who you mentioned, did go off the board. Chase Brown goes off the board, but we do have a variety of players in the queue and available. But we're waiting on the tight end position here. But is that what we're looking at? Probably 1 wide receiver, 1 running back, 1 tight end as we approach these final 3 picks.
Yeah, I think we could be done at receiver unless we have a must-grab name. I think we're looking at...
There's not many must-grab names, Shawn, at this point of the draft. They are...
Well, I like the names who are on our queue. And so if we had a wide receiver of that caliber, we'd be looking at it. But I think this is either 2 tight end and 1 running back, or 1 tight end and 2 running back. You had mentioned the buy issue. I think as long as we have somebody else there, that's not a huge concern to me. You just got to pick the best guy at this point. That seems pretty clearly to be Hunter Henry. It's Hunter Henry and, more or less nothing. Are you comfortable enough to go ahead and get him so we have that covered, and then we can focus on the best picks in 19 and 20?
Yeah, we have quite a few running backs that we like, so hopefully all of those options, Hunter Henry. I also think it was at that point where it's 1v1 decision to try and make, and it was I believe the conversation, it was Thornton or Gesicki. They went back to back, and that was in round 14. We're in the middle of round 18 now. Pricing everything into it when it's not one position versus the other with the same buy, I'm okay to take Henry there. The tricky part is if you are in it, and you're in week 11 and Dulcich is injured or misses that week, you're taking a 0 at the tight end position. But realistically, that's 11 points. You may miss out on the playoffs by 11 points, but you're probably not going to. It's probably going to be more than that when it all comes down to it. How much so, Shawn, are you playing? I always find the buy is something that I use as a tiebreaker more than anything, and that was kind of the tiebreaker version of both players on week 11 buys playing for the Patriots and our other tight end with that buy. Is it something that you put any emphasis on, or is it just a tiebreaker?
Well, I mean, you need a draft so that you have as much potential upside and the guys there in every week. That's one of the values of getting the third quarterback, even though history will tell you that if you hit on the right two, you don't need it. The 3 quarterbacks that we have different buys. It's not ideal that our 2-star running backs and Jonathan Taylor and Ramondre Stevenson both have that week 11 buy as well. And week 11 is a week that for this particular squad could be a little bit tricky. We would probably not want to put another week 11 buy on top of it if we have that option, but it really is so crucial to pick the best players at this juncture. And so that is the thing that I'm mostly emphasizing.
Yeah, so we have a few Patriots in there. We have the Colts all week 11 by, so that's Jonathan Taylor, Stevenson. Then we have the Falcons as well, and Pitts and Ritter, and then that's Taquan Thornton and Hunter Henry. So there is quite a few in there, but I think hopefully the rest of the weeks and the players that are available, that's the week we want those guys to save all their points to bring us through in those two. So we have 2 selections left, Shawn. Feels like unless things change, it's going to be RB here as we see things out. But there's, Shawn mentioned there not being a huge amount of wide receiver options. The names here, Hunter Renfrow, Josh Palmer, Paris Campbell, Richie James, Robert Woods. There's just not a huge amount to go around in this. Allen Robinson's all the way down there towards the bottom, Marvin Jones, McCole Hardman's in there, Tim Patrick coming back from injury with a lot of competition around him. Just a really challenging zone here to be trying to pick up some wide receivers. So we'll see. Laviska Shenault, Shawn's all the way down there. If you keep scrolling down far enough, you can find him there as well. But yeah, it feels like the options that are available with the best players are at the running back position. I'm kind of surprised that we've seen Abanikanda continue to slide as far as he has here. Dwayne McBride's there. Ezekiel Elliott, Shawn, where does Elliott end up? Does he end up back with the Cowboys?
I don't think it's completely guaranteed that he ends up in the NFL at all. He was so washed
XFL?
at the end. The USFL has the fun team names. Maybe his future is 2024 USFL. MVP. It is always a little shocking to see him available this late. Clyde Edwards-Helaire, someone who also available late here. Colm, what just happened? I feel like we lost.
We could pair him with Jonathan Taylor. We could have Jonathan Taylor and Clyde Edwards-Helaire on the one roster.
So Eric takes Travion one slot ahead of us in round 19. So thoughts. Elliott and Edwards-Helaire, interesting picks. But Abanikanda is your preference. I like that one. That's the most fun pick.
I think it's Elliott has to end up somewhere, Shawn. Like these owners, they just love running backs. They will think that they can rejuvenate him and he'll be in the best shape of his life. So it is baffling that he is there. Well past ADP. I'll also be baffled if anyone drafts him in this particular room. But yeah, Abanikanda was the option, and I'm hoping that McBride may slide back through around here to us. We'll see what happens there. But out of those guys, the conversation, Shawn, really, Elliott and Edwards-Helaire are probably not people that are ever going to be on our boards. But when you get to this point of the draft and they're still available, were you tempted to draft them there?
Well, with Elliott, you have around 15 ADP. With Edwards-Helaire, you have around 17 ADP. I mean, that's already in the range where more or less all drafters are saying that these guys could fall through, could fall all the way out, that they're not necessarily draftable players. And I think that I would agree with that. The balance that you're trying to work here is between getting the upside and not taking such big swings that you have a lot of players who are more or less getting 0 snaps down the stretch. And one of the things that Blair has done a nice job of demonstrating is that the rookies early in many ways are better than rookies late, where it feels like, okay, well, late, I can take the risk. It's no big deal. The expectation of points from these slots are so low anyway. And yet that's where if you come back and you get some of those veteran points that aren't necessarily locked in, if they were locked in, those players will also be going earlier, but you can take some shots that are sort of interesting with veteran players at the end of drafts. I tend to have guys that I like enough and think have that combination of upside and talent where we've got guys who are not on our board. We have players who, just because they were drafted, we wouldn't be looking at taking. And yet when you have a player like Abanikanda, when you have a player like McBride, especially if the situation seems to lend itself. And I mean, the Vikings don't have very much blocking McBride. The Jets do have sort of an interesting backfield with Zonovan Knight and Michael Carter if Breece Hall is not ready to go to start the season. And yet the talent gap in all likelihood is so vast between Abanikanda and those other two guys that you want to go ahead and take your shot there. So one of the things you could do is you could come back with a Zonovan Knight. You could go to a play like a Shawn Tucker, someone who probably doesn't even make the team and yet is more talented than anybody else they have on their depth chart. A lot of different ways you can go about it here. Colm, we're one pick away. McBride did go. And so we're now again looking at picks that probably aren't our favorite, but you can understand what the thesis would be behind them.
Yeah, well, PR Strong, somebody who's available. I do think based on the week 11 bye, Shawn, we should skip past him just to give us another option on that week. You make a pitch here, Shawn. There's nothing of vast excitement here. Shawn Tucker maybe is there. This was the zone, Shawn. Last year we took Geno Smith in, that was a rock star for this team. So no pressure on the 20th round pick this year, but we need this pick to bring us to the finals.
So you're not going with Darnold. You're not going with Gardner Minshew as that similar.
No, I had thought about Kyle Trask as a potential option, but I think with our 3 quarterbacks, we don't need to do that. And also Kyle Trask did go since our 19th round pick.
Yeah, he goes at the 2001. Deuce Vaughn is an interesting name here. The Cowboys have absolutely nothing behind Tony Pollard, and we would not expect
until Ezekiel Elliott comes back. Here's the bet, Shawn. Who scores more points for the Cowboys this year, Ezekiel Elliott or Deuce Vaughn?
Well, I'm going Deuce Vaughn.
And that's our pick. That's our pick, whoever it is.
Oh, that's the pick? You're completely out on Clyde Edwards-Helaire?
Yeah.
Okay. I think that's the right answer. So for me, Deuce Vaughn, Shawn Tucker, Zonovan Knight, you can get both shots at the Jets guys late. Probably more fun to split those shots up between different teams. A couple of Arizona Cardinals receivers and Michael Wilson and Greg Dortch are also, vaguely interesting at the very end at that position. But Colm, we are going to go with a Blair Andrews special, select Deuce Vaughn, and anticipate him being the second coming of the small, electric, pass-catching superstar out of Kansas State.
Yeah, when we look at the Cowboys, obviously I was joking there about Elliott, and I think there is a chance that Elliott is back there. But and the reason for that is they really don't have anything outside of Pollard and Vaughn, really. It's a limited depth chart. You mentioned Edwards-Helaire, and as the draft was going on, I was pulling up some information. I was like, do we even consider drafting him? And, we joke about how bad of a pick that was for the Kansas City Chiefs, but astonishingly just still 24 years old. But, even with just McKinnon and Pacheco ahead of him, it's hard to see him turn it around that he would be the lead back there in terms of what we've seen from him through his career. Like playing for the Kansas City Chiefs with 11 a total of 17 touchdowns with 11 rushing touchdowns, 6 passing touchdowns, 1,600 yards rushing. Since he came into the NFL, in basically the best offense in the entire NFL, it hasn't been a good selection, Shawn.
No, it hasn't. But I do think that he's got a shot because Isaiah Pacheco is also not good at all.
Also not
and
good.
Jarrett McKinnon never is
has tired legs sometimes.
So, yeah, I mean, so you've got a pretty clear path to meaningful touches in the NFL's best offense. You could see that working out, but it didn't turn out to be a pick that was enough fun to make. And Colm, I do like the guys that we got down the stretch. Again, we finish out with our last 6 picks. 4 of them are rookie running backs. There are historical reasons to go a different direction there. And yet, Colm, if we can't hit on fun running back names late, we will not be able to effectively and justifiably carry the 0 RB mantle forward.
Yeah, and I think, like, there's going to be times where it definitely won't work out for those rookies. There's some of those that you're, punching tickets for, it's just they're not going to get much of a shot. Some of them are going to be later picks, for example, in the NFL. Some of them are behind competition, but much more exciting than going with the names that that are probably just going to plod along and probably do absolutely the likes of, we took Deuce Vaughn, Joshua Kelly as a pick after. There's picks in this range where the upside really does not stay there for me versus what these rookies might do. So, Shawn, to run down through the roster again, it is a case that we have Joe Burrow, Sam Howell, Desmond Ridder at quarterback. We have Jonathan Taylor, Ramondre Stevenson, Rashad Penny, Rashawn Johnson, Zach Evans, Abanikanda, Vaughn at running back. And then it's T. Higgins, Chris Godwin, Jahan Dodson, Elijah Moore, Sky Moore, Tyquan Thornton, Wan'Dale Robinson at the wide receiver position, Pitts, Dulcich, and Henry at tight end. When we read through those names, Shawn, the tricky part of a draft like this is when you do start it off and you get yourself, those running backs early, which we did in Jonathan Taylor, Ramondre Stevenson, you get that tight end. We talked a little bit about this, with the Best Ball Mania last week when we looked at, the elite tight end with a hyper fragile start. And when you draft, an elite quarterback and then you're getting those non-wide receiver positions, it makes it a little bit hard to fill out that wide receiver depth. I think we did a nice enough job as the draft went along to get some of those young players to have some upside potentially baked into those, but there's also risks with those. We mentioned the crowded wide receiver room, for example, with the Giants, the New England Patriots. I mentioned that there's quite a few there as well. The tight ends are there. There's a lot of competition. So there's reasons why these things may not work out. We're very positive on Elijah Moore, but obviously it didn't work out last year for him. He's moved teams. See how that plays out. So there is questions around it. Overall, I think it's very balanced in how the roster has turned out. We'd always like the wide receivers to potentially be that little bit stronger, but the detours we took to get, Burrow over, let's say, Justin Jefferson, and then, to get Jonathan Taylor and to get Ramondre Stevenson, I'm pretty happy. We'll do a full breakdown of the entire draft for our team and other teams as a review show, but just general thoughts, Shawn, and how you feel as to how our squad has come out here.
This was more or less the dream draft, I think, and especially when you're drafting with the OT listeners, I think that looking at where we took our QB2 and QB3 is going to be interesting in the recap show. There are so many creative and I think really effective builds from the other drafters here. I think that one of the things you see in this draft that you don't necessarily see in generic rooms is that the drafters had a sense of what they wanted to do and accomplish that. Whether or not it will work, I mean, only 2 of the 12 teams can advance. So we know 10 teams will go home with the thesis that they employed not being successful, and yet there was a thesis. And so from that perspective, I'm really impressed with what everyone did. It's a huge advantage to have that pick at the 106 and be able to do the things that we did there. But the balance on this team, the upside for the team, I think that this is a tournament type of team. So from that perspective, I'm really happy with the way things turned out.
Yeah, so we'll do the breakdown. We'll talk through it. That'll be a bonus show that'll come out this week. So hopefully everyone will enjoy that. That one will be audio only. It will not come out on the RotoViz YouTube channel. So check out the podcast side of things and make sure you are subscribed. That is RotoViz Overtime, available on all podcast platforms. Drop us a written review on your favorite podcast app. We would appreciate that greatly. If you're signing up over at rotoviz.com to use the tools, you want to use a promo code to save yourself 10%. Why wouldn't you? You can use the code RVRadio2023 at checkout. Save yourself 10%. Get access to all the content and tools, including Shawn's work that is available there. That's where you can find all Shawn's articles that come out each and every week. Then we'll discuss a little bit here on the shows. But again, RV Radio 2023. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening along as we drafted. Hopefully you have enjoyed our player thoughts as we move through it here. We will be back with much more shows in the coming weeks and the coming days. So make sure, again, as always, you are subscribed to RotoViz Overtime. And until we are back, have a good one.